So just to give you a little introduction to Alex, Alex has almost 10 years experience in defining and delivering high impact graph analytics and machine learning solutions for a variety of industry problems, from detecting organized crime to key opinion leaders. Alex founded Knight Analytics to enable the companies she works with to easily combine internal and external data sources into knowledge graphs to power internal analytics. So today, Alex's talk is going to discuss monitoring commercial developments using knowledge graphs. Give me 1 second.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be speaking at the second webinar from Biorelate, and thanks very much to Daniel and the team for inviting me to speak here today. I'm going to be covering how we at Knight Analytics are monitoring commercial developments using knowledge graphs. My name's Alex Ridden, and I'm a machine learning engineer by trade and one of the founders of Knight Analytics. The background of our company is that we weren't actually originally in biotech or pharmaceuticals, but instead come from a background of in-depth experience in the detection of financial and organised crime. Today, I plan on taking you through our journey on how we used a lot of that knowledge and experience in order to help detect and monitor companies, research, trials, and other developments in the pharma industry. First off, I'm going to introduce our company in a bit more detail. Knight Analytics is a software company whose main goal is really to simplify the combining of data and unlocking insights by making it really, really easy and intuitive to build knowledge graphs. We were founded in 2018 and we're based in Utrecht City in the Netherlands. A lot of the inspiration for creating our business was really focused on the question, how can we shorten the time to value of data science projects in any industry? So in 2020, we launched our knowledge building engine and we built a number of custom enterprise knowledge graphs. And in 2021, we decided to make one of those projects more generic and we launched our Pharma Insights application. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our experience is in financial crime investigations and detection, and they have very transferable requirements to a massive amount of industry problems. Network analytics in general has been used for decades. If you think about the way that investigations are portrayed on television, they're often seen drawing networks of people, places, things, objects in order to better understand whatever problem is that they're dealing with. We're basically trying to scale that approach so that we can get machines to do the same and help monitor larger investigations into the commercial world. A big part of what we do is in entity resolution, normalization of the data, and the matching of these real-world objects. A step above what we were doing in network analytics in fraud was to then add useful ontologies and inference into the graphs we built in order to actually create knowledge graphs. And hopefully along this presentation, you'll see how that applies quite directly to getting insights in the pharmaceutical industry as well. So a bit about our technology. It consists of 3 main components. We have a semantic engine which is used for the processing of free text or unstructured data into triples. We have a knowledge builder, and a key piece of AI inside of that is mostly around the entity resolution, but of course the parsing and cleansing of different data types. At this stage, the knowledge graph is really built, and in some of our use cases, it can just be directly consumed by data users. But what I'm going to talk about mostly today is our Pharma Explorer, which is where we use AI on top of everything that we've built in order to draw out interesting insights and display them in a user interface. Some of our core capabilities of the platform are in continuous streaming and updating of data. This was particularly important when we were working in finance, because you'd have ongoing investigations which needed to be updated live. And we found that it's also extremely useful in the Pharma Insight app, mostly because it allows us to update and incorporate new data into our graph without having to rebuild everything from scratch. We also have very fast throughput, mostly because our engine was originally built to also handle logs and transaction data, which scales across machines. I've said here that we can do around 300,000 triples a minute. That's actually just based on a single machine, similar to maybe a good desktop that someone might have at home. Our AI and machine learning is also integrated throughout all three offerings, and we've built GraphQL API and a Spark connector, which means that once the knowledge graph is built, you can really integrate it directly into front-end applications, download the data for offline evaluation, and integrate it anywhere in the company. It's worth mentioning that the engine that powers our Pharmaceutical Insight Explorer is the same engine that we utilize when we help organizations to build their custom knowledge graphs in-house. We also do on-premise and cloud deployments using Kubernetes. We're horizontally scalable, and something that is really exciting is that we also have kind of ongoing research with Roseman Labs, where we're looking at how we can build knowledge graphs and share data across privacy boundaries using their multi-party computation technology. I think it probably has some really important applications in the pharmaceutical industry, but for today I won't be focusing on that particular project. So what was our journey into pharma? This is kind of the meat of this presentation. I want to explain a little bit better our journey. It really all started with a question from a colleague when they asked us, well, how can I really find who's influential in my field? When they brought us this question, our first answer was, well, let's take a look at the data you have available and how people have historically done this. We recognized a number of things. Firstly, that there was a lot of bulk data downloads and getting continuous updates from multiple different sources and aggregating all that data was quite difficult. Majority of the data which would be used was unstructured. So you really rely on the searching tools that each bulk data download had available, and they really varied in their ability to help you find what you were looking for. And then finally, to actually curate and aggregate data, especially around key opinion leader detection, was a very manual process and often involved Excel spreadsheets. We spoke with one professional who worked on key opinion leader detection for around 30 years and worked out that the process took months and it was very manual and resulted in a few interviews. So there were other curated data providers, but there seemed to be quite a long user journey to actually answering certain questions. It seemed like data was generally kept in many, many different places, and you might have to visit multiple subscription services in order to curate and build up a catalogue of understanding that would help you as a pharmaceutical company really understand your market. So once we saw that this question could be better automated using our capabilities, we wanted to understand the challenge a bit more. And we looked at essentially what other questions are out there. So basically, if you're an early stage pharmaceutical company, what's your journey to really understanding your market? If you come from a place where you have limited resource, you might only have limited people who can actually spend time on any one of these questions. How can we automate as much as possible the evidence finding? We found that a lot of the questions actually also applied to larger pharmaceuticals as well. So when we were categorizing these initial questions, we came up with three kind of categories. The first one is commercial insight, with questions like what competing drugs are being developed, what are the market trends, are there relevant historical trials or research that we should know about? And this sounds like it's obvious to find at the moment, but as I'll show later, when the variety of names with which a single disease can be called, it sometimes makes it very difficult and easy to miss important updates, and just generally monitoring of the industry is difficult. Maybe even announcements such as acquisitions or new trials that are not formally registered yet. And those are the types of things that you really have to read continuously news updates for. The second big category is how can we best inform research, starting with things like who would be great as an advisor. it's something like, could you find a history of clinical trials in the development of a drug? Is there someone who could be on our board, somebody who could help advise us on how to penetrate the market? Related to all of these is, of course, the key opinion leader detection. So finally, we thought about raising money as an aspect. It's particularly important for small companies, but if you flip it on its head, it really can be very useful for large industries as well to find potentially interesting acquisitions. So the question really here was, who can I talk to for investment? Are they part of a kind of group of people where they're commonly investing together? Who's possibly good to invest in? Like I said, if you flip it on its head and we extrapolate, you eventually can answer the question, maybe even what kind of evaluation is reasonable, or what evidence do I have of similar products to mine that have reached certain stages of investment and had certain levels of evaluation. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list of questions. It's really just a good start for us and helped us to get our first steps in curating and getting to industry insight knowledge graph. So how do we really get started? There's going to be a number of steps here to getting the data together, and what are they? So firstly, we sketched out some rough ideas, none of which were necessarily what we ended up with, but the process in itself was useful. We found it to be a very big fact-finding mission for us. Firstly, we had to look at and find existing ontologies in the area, see what we could utilize. We were able to feed back into some of those, which is really nice. We then defined the first questions that we wanted to help answer and understand how users would actually interact with what we were building. We explored the available data sources that might be ready for us to consume, and we started to really ingest and parse and root through all of that information. We're kind of continuously improving our solution still today, and we iteratively test and validate those insights with people who are more experienced in this space than us and really cared about the results. Okay, so I just want to talk through a little bit of the story of the types of relationships that we're talking about to help you understand the basic ideas captured in our graph so that you can understand how we reach useful insight. All of these company names are completely made up. It's probably quite obvious. Starting with Umbrella Corporation here, this might be an example of like a company that you're thinking of talking with, or somebody that you already know about but you want more context on. And we started to think, okay, it might be interesting to know who are the investors here. So we've got VirtueCon, who's invested in Umbrella Corp. Maybe that's part of a news article and we've detected this particular semantic relationship, but we potentially also see more than one investor. Here you can see Acme. Maybe that is something that you want to consider an investing community since they've co-invested. We also potentially can detect acquisitions, takeovers, and other interesting events. So I put Acme acquiring of pharma XYZ here. And you might want to consider those part of the same investment community as well if it's been acquired by one of the companies that co-invested with VirtueCon. But aside from that, there's also research questions. So when a company has sponsored maybe a piece of research and a published paper has come from it, it's useful to know the types of diseases that are mentioned, focused in on the research paper. And equally, if they sponsor clinical trials, that's also useful information. Part of what our application is particularly good at is filtering all the different data sources down to quite niche disease areas, which then allows you to see the aggregated insights per disease type or parent disease when you're evaluating companies. Of course, there were many different challenges to building graphs like this, some of which we were very familiar with, some of which we weren't. So first off, I'll start with the easy ones, the challenges that we were more familiar with. Something that comes up a lot is entity resolution, disambiguation, and normalization. All these kind of words are used for the similar thing, but essentially one of the big challenges that crosses both pharma and banking is that when you have multiple businesses with different names or potentially similar names, can you spot that they are the same? Or maybe when you spot a disease, which could refer to multiple diseases, or it could have many, many different names, how do you determine that two that you find in different sources are the same? And that's particularly important when you have aggregating data across multiple different sources. In some cases, you might have sources with IDs. An ID you might be particularly familiar with is an ORC ID, which is used to define authors of papers, which is used by some people quite heavily, but others not. And in some situations, particularly let's say in news articles, you're not going to have an ORC ID, so you need to be able to reconcile what or who is being talked about without relying on that kind of ID information. And then we have the fact that there's lots of different data available for this problem. Thankfully, that's also something we've met before. So we already had quite a flexible platform which allowed us to integrate data from different places easily. And this naturally comes along with lots of different interesting semantic and complex relationships which we can store in our database and expand on without taking the database down or pausing. The final piece of this puzzle is that we're able to handle the continuous monitoring, updating, and refreshing of entities and the links to given entities. Okay, so on to some of the challenges that we were less familiar with. These are the bits and bobs that we really had to invest a bit more time into developing. So I talked about sparse entity data, and when extracting entities from text, there's some situations where the information you know about an entity is extremely sparse. So we needed to enhance our resolution to handle and reconcile entities even better than we were already. We made a few adaptations and improvements to our resolution models off the back of that, which has made us able to better reconcile entities from unstructured data. We had to develop a number of natural language processing models which allow us to extract different entity types that we hadn't really dealt with before. Diseases being one of them. You can see in this simple example how definitions can get quite complicated quickly. Here we have a display of the names of some nail infections. If someone's interested in this market, there's multiple different names that they could use. This really highlights why, as a person, it can be particularly difficult to get a complete view of everything, because you might have to enter 20 different search terms under an umbrella in order to pull back all the relevant information. So to explain a bit better, not every single article that mentions very specific disease names also mentions the parent of that disease, such as nail infection. So you might want to see all developments for a disease and all the sub-child diseases in that area. We enable that. For us, that obviously was a new area, so we had to employ the advice and insight from specialists and experts to help validate what we were actually doing was useful. Clearly, a lot of the challenges also came from the data being across the globe, so handling the international languages is something we're always improving on. And then finally, just summarising the outcomes in a way that was most useful for users. The majority of our previous use cases were for technical users, so we made our graph available to them to download, and in this case we're building an insight app on top of that graph. So I'm going to quickly go through the steps that we take and show you the parts which are automated by our app. Firstly, designing the ontology is a completely custom step, but mapping and extracting key information from the data, generating triples to store in the graph, and resolving of entities whilst also loading, scaling, maintaining the graph is all part of our knowledge building engine. And then the consumption from the graph and the feedback from the user app back into the graph was something that we built with the pharma industry in mind. To explain a bit more about what entity resolution is and why it can be difficult for machines to do this quickly, here's an example we can walk through. So here you see some variations of my name, and one of which I think looks particularly not like my name, the bottom one, Alice. Even as a person, it might be difficult to say which ones represent the same person, with shared nicknames like Al potentially referencing multiple people. This can be even more difficult if you have a more common name like John Smith. So some of what we might look at is information found in papers where certain specialized diseases are mentioned or used, and once we've matched those diseases, does that help inform whether two people are the same? If you're lucky enough, you might know which affiliations they also work with. That also requires some resolution to match the different pieces of evidence together. So humans are really good at doing this at a small scale. So one of the big questions and challenges is in doing this resolution at scale. How do you make this fast enough such that you can consume data and reconcile it with all of your back catalogue of data at quick enough speeds that it's usable? So we've got quite a lot of IP in this area, which made it really easy to adapt to new and complicated entity resolution problems. This was really just to show you how easily and quickly it gets complicated. Okay, so the part that we needed to develop more were really these entity recognition models for the pharmaceutical industry in particular. We've got an example here of the kind of people and places and events that we were interested in, and we built and enhanced models for diseases, events, amounts, people, organizations, dates, and we continue to build on and improve all of these models and more. Here you can see how we took the text at the top to form a graph. So we've got this person, Joseph Papa, who's the chairman and CEO of Bausch Health, and they are the parent company of Salix. And this particular piece of information is telling us that they acquired the assets of Synergy. And on top of that, we had to enhance our contextual resolution to allow us to better reconcile these types of entities, integrated a number of pharma ontologies, added more semantic reasoning, inference, and that led us to our Insight platform. We purposefully built up the Insight platform quite gradually so that we could ingest a disease area at a time, and that's mostly because different disease areas seem to have very slightly different insights and nuances that we needed to be mindful of. So what kind of insights can you get to when you combine data in this way? At a macro level, you can just filter down to different levels of the disease type hierarchy. And from that, you can kind of cluster research institutes, investors, and companies. When we combine multiple sources of data, you can build up timelines of companies' involvement in particular areas, and you can see how that developed over time. The impact that this had for our users was that we were able to discover important trials that they were actually unaware of. They contacted influencers who maybe would have normally flown under the radar because a lot of aggregators kind of just do a very simple count of research papers. We understand that the frequency, recency, volume play a big role in how influential you might think somebody is. We also have used a number of graph algorithms that help inform the ranking of different businesses and people, and we've helped discover investors during fundraising rounds. The overall main goal of really being able to keep them informed of market developments. So that brings me on to where are we now? I want to finish by letting you know that we're currently we're continuously onboarding new disease areas as per our clients' needs, and we're adding new functionality to our platform every day. You can request beta access to where we can interview you, find out which questions would be helpful to get answers to, and help build out that capability whilst validating the platform with you. And as mentioned before, our original model was built for purpose for one company, and we actually then productionized it, which is why we now have a beta platform for other companies. Our backlog is very active, and we're continuously adding new sources, improving our entity extraction models, and expanding on our semantic ontology. All requests and feedbacks are considered and valuable in helping us to expand the types of questions we can answer. So if you'd like to get access or discuss any of the things I've mentioned in today's talk, then feel free to reach out to me at any of these places. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you found it interesting.